And from a water board perspective, I always feel a little bit like I'm playing from really underneath a big rock. So just documented needs for wastewater in the state of California total $36 billion, and drinking water in the magnitude of $29 billion. So, even though I've got hundreds of millions of dollars in Prop 1, how do we wisely use that to, leverage projects that are, as the Prop 1 spells out, the ones that need the extra push or the extra guys to help them get going, and then leverage that with our existing SRF funds as well as local funds and dollars to try to get that done. As you can see with the billion dollar numbers I mentioned, there's no proposition size that we can get out from that, and the majority of projects that we deal with are largely local funded. So we're looking for those instances where we can really try to help out. In that, guys, our programs are set up as kind of a one-stop. So we gave up a long time ago asking people to apply for all our different programs and said, you know what, if you've got a drinking water project, you apply to us. And then we use our expertise to try to figure out all the funding sources available to us, as well as those with our partners at like USDA and others, to try to figure out how we can get a project done the best way possible for those local folks to do. And then the thing that scares me the most as we do this, while we're talking a lot about money for capital projects, really the operation and maintenance costs after we get done building them are always the hugest cost going forward that a community has to bear. And some of them have a really difficult time with that. And so that's the part that is always a bit troubling and challenging for us in working with them and trying to establish it. There are places where I could build a great treatment project and they wouldn't be able to afford the electricity bill to actually run the system after we're done, and that presents a real challenge on how we work through those.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Landis.
Yes, I would like to chime in on this. I mentioned that yesterday we released a request for concept papers. Those are due on March 15th, and that will give us a good idea of what projects we can expect to see as we get to the application process later this year. But the point I want to make is that we did have a survey before we started on our regulation process and stakeholder process about a year ago. The concept paper is much more fine-tuned than that survey, but the survey showed us that there were well over $11 billion in potential storage projects out there compared to the $2.7 billion that we have.
Great. We have a number of members who have questions, and so we'll start with Mr. Dodd.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate the comments from the directors here, and at least three of you had talked about capacity building for disadvantaged communities and also small rural communities. I think that's really important, particularly for communities that are so economically disadvantaged counties, like Lake County, for example, that probably don't have the resources to even leverage these funds, which we know that we need, but yet those are really incredibly important environmental concerns for our state. For example, like Clear Lake, just using one. And even though it's also interesting that I have found this over time as a county supervisor as well, that when we do grant approvals, the ones that are getting the grants have the best grant writers that really know the points to key in on. But these small rural counties or disadvantaged communities that aren't maybe checking all the boxes or aren't, experienced enough to know what really scores well when it comes down to it, don't get the funds. So you wondered if you just switch those grant writers, how that would all work in the end. And so I'm happy to hear that you're doing that. But I guess my question is it's got to be a challenge for all of you to, when you're supposed to have a fair and open process, to be helping communities, certain communities at the expense of, at the others. So I guess I love the fact that I'm hearing capacity building, but how do you resolve that that challenge of in resolving that potential conflict?
Well, let me take a stab, and then I know that Director Bonham would probably like to as well. Let me give you one example. I can't remember now which program it is that I administer, but this question exactly came up And I said, we're trying to get certain money out to certain rural areas that don't have much capacity. How are we making sure they're not disadvantaged? And we instituted a new part of the process where we instituted a brief letter of intent. And you did not have to have the extensive capacity to offer the letter of intent. You had to have the clear goals, and you had to say that you would be able to carry out the grant. And then based on the letter of intent, we invited people to apply. And at that point, it was allowing us to get at what might be the best proposals without depending on their capacity up front to do the more complete application. And then we would cross the bridge of how they did the application once they had an accepted letter of intent. That was just one way, process-wise, to get around that issue so that we could make sure that it just wasn't people's ability to do grants that was allowing them to succeed in the process.
I can think of 2 or 3 important steps our department is probably looking at, but I can't resolve what will continue to be an issue. Assume we always get 100 to 200 applications and that we can only fund 30. It's hard to envision a future where the numerically ranked 189th project really has a pathway into the top 20. That said, first, I do think our department is committed to this idea of those who were close calling us. I don't think that interferes with fairness and objectivity. You should expect as an applicant to hear how you were graded and use that as an improvement cycle. Next step, I think we found in this broad first applicant pool that not everyone knew exactly what we were up to as to structure, timeline. So we need to do better informing particularly some of these communities that are less sophisticated in the granting cycles that, hey, you've got a deadline coming up in 6 months, get ready for it. The last thing I'll say is kind of a plea for y'all's assistance to the extent this is appropriate. I feel a little stuck between 2 parts of the statute. One part of the statute says, I'm paraphrasing, run a competitive grant-making process based on metrics and accountability. The other part says no earmarks. Keeping those corners square is an important objective I have. I could use your help on that. And don't conclude just because in a given year our department elects not to fund something you may have a strong interest in, that it may not be funded by the Wildlife Conservation Board or one of the appropriate conservancies. Because we're looking across our interest and making sure we avoid funding duplicity. It may mean I don't pick it up, but someone else plans to.
Let me just add that when I was a member of the Assembly, I was against earmarks for the other 79 districts.
That's a great point. So I just want to, for the sake of everyone now, we have 6 more members that would like to ask questions, and every member should have the opportunity to ask a question of the panel. We also have 2 other panels, and next we have Mr. Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to focus in on El Nino and the new water that is up in the mountains and is flowing in our rivers. How much of the money that you are putting out now will be able to store and save the El Nino runoff? Or, if none will, does that mean that the excess water simply runs out and is wasted?
Assembly member, I'm going to take the first part of your question and say I think our grant making is focused on improving storage at the higher elevation. It's conventional wisdom, and I think correct conventional wisdom, that our best storage asset is the Sierra. And that is a reason why you'll find 2 primary actions in Chapter 4 of the California Water Action Plan to be managing headwaters for multiple benefits, and restoring 10,000 acres of Sierra Meadows. If we can collaboratively restore Mountain Meadows, then I believe we'll get natural storage benefit. We'll slow down runoff. We'll reduce sediment load into almost all the major power and water supply company reservoirs. And we can keep the water upslope longer so that it trickles off better for our future hydrologic circumstance, which is why we put that metric in and we made it a funding priority. So I can tell you that we've got more projects in design. I think we're getting close to about 1,500 acres in design. Remember, my metric's 10,000 acres. And we haven't done enough implementation yet. I think that's because we got a ton of things in planning. We haven't gotten them through environmental review, but I expect in the next couple of years we're going to shift over to a lot of implementation projects in that sector, if you will. I can't give you a percentage of
what I'm trying
rainfall captured because of a restored meadow.
Will you be able to spend that money in time to help the stream flows and to help with the El Nino run? I'm specifically trying to get to, is this money being spent sufficient and being spent in ways that will in fact capture and save what some estimates are could be a couple of million acre feet of additional new water?
Let me take a stab at that, because the existing system is so underutilized with capacity right now that the existing system should be able to capture the overwhelming majority of what comes from El Nino. The money from this bond in some places will not be ready at the time for this El Nino. If storage comes from this process, it will not be online by the time this El Nino is completed. And with other things such as what Mr. Bonham was saying, and amazingly, if you do good conservation or recycling and it lessens the need for water and storage, it allows you to capture the storage and go to full capacity there. So all these things over time, if there's a next El Nino, will be online in a way to maximize it. But the existing system is so low right now that it ought to be able to capture most everything. And the one issue is the issue that's the mother of all issues that will divide this committee, and that is right now in the Delta, there's not a way to capture excess flows if it goes by the storage. In 2010, once you had what you had for environmental water, once you had what you had for water supply, there was roughly 800,000 acre feet that flowed through the Delta and into the bay and into the ocean that could have been used for supply if there was a facility that could have captured it, and there's not one that exists in that way now. It is the reason the all of the above strategy is here. So you try to figure out some method of conveyance in the Delta, you try to do storage, you try to do the wetlands at the higher altitudes that help you capture things and take advantage of the Sierra, and you put them all together for more water sustainability.
Senator Vidak, I, and others sent a letter with respect to the decision to essentially deny 208,000 acre feet. That's 450,000 individuals for a year. The point I'm getting to, and then I'll add to that, the Associated Press on January 8th wrote about much of the torrential rain that fell in Southern California this week flowed into the ocean, and I'm trying to be specific with respect to El Nino. There is net new additional water. If the same discretion that you utilize, we will end up seeing that still flow for a delta smelt and other. And look, there's a lot of differing points of view about how much value the analysis has put into the predation of the smelt with respect to the striped bass. So what I'm asking is, are we currently still in the governor's declaration of emergency? We are?
Yes.
Yes. And I want to explore to what kind of discretion does that give to the governor, both with respect to the state project and the federal project, to perhaps make some management decisions that will see to it that the people who are needing to get the flows for.
I'm going to let Director Bonham answer, but the short answer is that
a short answer is welcome.
Gives
here.
maximum discretion under the law to take those actions.
Okay,
Mr. Patterson, I think you've made your point, and it's welcome here. And I would allow Mr. Bonham to answer that if he'd like to. I think Mr. Laird made the point as well.
I can make this real quick. You don't really need to. I do appreciate the answer, and the answer was you have wide levels of discretion. There are many of us who are asking you to use it for the sake of people.
Thank you, Mr. Patterson. Next, we have Mr. Salas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll be, I know we're short on time, so I'll be probably a little more direct. I know Ms. Secretary Laird and I think Ms. Landis also touched upon this, about the storage piece and the water. And I know you said very articulate in mentioning that there were no specific earmarks, but in Proposition 1 under Chapter 8, we do reference the Cal-Fed Record of Decision. Under the Record of Decision, I think it goes back to 2000, so over 16 years ago, where they push forward temperance and sites as projects that are probably the most ready to utilize some storage. And so I was looking at that and just wondering, you also mentioned why that there's a built-in delay, and I'm just still trying to understand why a built-in delay is in there if we have this record of decision that goes back over 16 years, and why we just wouldn't move forward with it.
I was going to ask Director Landis to respond, but I'll be equal direct.
Please.
While that exists, it doesn't override the process for determining that a project meets the goals for the state, and it has to be ready and it has to apply, even if the record of decision puts those up. So we're looking for whoever's the advocate for sites in Temperance Flat to have the local commitments, raise the money, and have an application to the state at the time that it's ready. That doesn't exist now, but we would totally entertain that if people get it ready at the time the regulations specify.
And I believe
how
our
to
group's
apply.
doing that now.
Yeah.
I would just add to that and our stakeholder group, which was very active and helpful in developing the regulations, we had active participants that represented sites, Temperance, and Los Vaqueros.
Thank you. Ms. Eggman.
Thank you. And my question will be brief. And I appreciate your earlier reference to projects that we're not working on right now. And just in light of last week, was it last week? When the governor put out his budget with the $3.6 million in there to integrate the water fix into the Delta plan, incorporate, I think was the term that was used. And I know we've backed away from that and saying, no, that's not what we meant. But I guess that's just kind of an indicator of the tunnel vision that has been displayed from time to time. And I'm just wondering, as one of the real key components in the Prop 1 money was that it not go for an existing plan or for conveyance. And since it seems like it slips in here and there, it slips around, what kind of structure do you have in place that will really help you use a better net filter mesh to be able to make sure that none of the projects will be going towards
Once again, I'm going to give the brief answer first, since you chose the tunnel analogy, and I would say there's two sides to every tunnel at the end. And basically, I wasn't prepared to read the statement that came from the Delta Stewardship Council that said that assertion simply wasn't true and named exactly what the money would go for. And I think your further question is how we monitor it, but we're clear in the statement that we're meeting the terms of the bond.
Assemblymember Eggman, the January gubernatorial budget proposed and the amount you just mentioned has nothing to do with Proposition 1 grant making. So I can tell you for my department that when we read the California Water Code as amended by Proposition 1, we see at least 5 statutory subsections which expressly provide funds shall neither go towards existing obligation or isolated alternative conveyance. That is a statutory prohibition, is one of the criteria we'd look at any application we got, and it would be punted out of the process if it violated one of those statutory prohibitions. And then finally, I get a slate recommended to me after all that independent objective review. I'm an attorney by training, and I take compliance with the statutes seriously.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bonham. Mr. Gordon.
Thank you. In the interest of time, and because I serve on the Budget Sub 3, where I'll get to ask these questions in depth, I just want to alert the administration that when we get to Budget Sub 3, the issues I want to focus in a little bit have to do with the state obligations, why some things were chosen, why Tahoe wasn't included, and really what's the impact of what we're proposing on Salton Sea. I'll ask those later.
Great. Thank you for the preview, Mr. Gordon. Mr. Bigelow.
Mr. Gordon, I'm not on your committee, but I'm starting to like your questions. My questioning area might help because I won't be there. Dealing with the end result under the governor's proposed budget of 2016-2017, Lake Tahoe was left out. It was one of 5 specific areas that was to be funded under the $475 million. Given the fact that an environmental improvement program was created to work between the state of California and the state of Nevada, and since the state of Nevada did go forth and recently approve a $100 million bond to take on this very issue where we were to have a sharing component, and this was agreed upon, to not see it there looks a little less than genuine. Why are we not meeting our partners that we said we would do something to help protect the great values of the Lake Tahoe Basin? Now, this has partners that are both federal, state, local agencies, private interests, and the Washoe tribe. It seems to me that when this does get to Mr. Gordon's committee, there better be a darn good answer. But I'd like to hear something today why we can't step up and take on this vital community and this wonderful wonder that does serve all of the state of California. That's my first question. I have a second one, Mr. Chairman, to follow up. It's in a different area.
Say them together.
So I'll say them together. Is there a direct answer? Does this department, does all departments support the creation of surface storage in the state of California, utilizing the $2.7 billion genuinely? Or are we just going to get lip service to it? I know that there's a time frame. Being one of the architects of the water bond, I'm well aware why it was put in there. But I want to know that those structures are going to be constructed post-haste.
Then I'll take your second question first. The answer is yes.
Thank you, Mr. Laird. I appreciate that. You don't have to go any farther.
Okay. Then I'll go to your first question. The Environmental Improvement Program in Tahoe was created in 1997. Since then, the state has put in $693 million. Over the same period, Nevada put in $118 million. We are committed to it. You don't put in $693 million and not be committed to it. And the point is that there are other places in the bond right now that are eligible. There is a federal bill moving with federal money that passed markup out of committee a week ago that could potentially require matches from the states, and that is not fully cooked yet. And that basically, given the fact that we have hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars demand on this, more than is available, we're going with what we absolutely have to do. And given that there's $39 million in other places in the budget that could be used for this right now, we think that's the first priority. And let's see what's required by the federal match if, in fact, that bill passes. And let's see, because some of this that I just listed as the state total was raised from other sources. So the question is that available that would lessen the reliance on this pot? all those questions aren't fully answered yet. So there's a total commitment to Tahoe, but there's a total commitment to make that money stretch as far as it can and leverage money in other sources, and those questions aren't fully in evidence yet. So that's why we have recommended what we recommended.
And I appreciate that response, and I do think that it would be probably prudent for us to at least look at what we kind of anticipate might be the need, given the potential of cut from the federal side and what our partners have already stepped up and said they would have. So that would put California on the hook to work with the state of Nevada and all of the partners for a tune of about $200 million.
But having done 60 hours of negotiations directly with the state of Nevada, we are on the hook to deal with Nevada. It's just a question of how we can best do it from the resources available.
Thank you, Mr. Laird.
All right, thanks, Mr. Bigelow. Mr. Williams.
Well, first, I want to back up Mr. Bigelow. I do think that it's a crucial time. I think you know that, Secretary Laird, you did put the blood, sweat, and tears into convincing Nevada to backing down off of pulling out of the compact. But I just think
for the record, part of my success was that they never backed down. They just agreed with us on the path forward.
So I do think it's a crucial time for us to be funding projects, whether it's from that pot or another pot. I wanted to ask two questions. One is, in the capacity of the state board, are we encouraging folks who run reservoirs, if they start getting up to 70% or 80% of capacity, to start storing some of that water in adjudicated groundwater basins so that they could store more water than if they spill? Of course, this would be a great blessing to have, but what's different now than in past droughts is that we do actually have additional storage all over the state that we're not using, which is groundwater basins that have been adjudicated that people can sink it into and pull it out for a fee that doesn't take millions of dollars for us to build anything. It's already sitting there. So that's question number one. And question number two is, so is this number in the water recycling and advanced treatment technology projects, the proposed appropriation, is that how many projects have already come forward for the one-to-one match? So should we be telling our locals, you better get your act in gear because nearly half of the money has already been applied for?
Yeah, so of the water recycling funding there, yes, nearly half of all the money has projects that are potentially pending. And like I mentioned, when you add in the total project costs, so the part that's got to be the local share match and stuff like that, we're looking at over $1.2 billion. That's very encouraging in the state that there's that many projects willing to move forward and ready to move forward. So it's pretty exciting in that regard. The first question, I'm afraid I'm not the best person to answer that directly. I'm the funding guy here, so I'll relay a little bit that I know.
Yeah, but you're the boogeyman to every dam in the state. Come on,
yeah. That's my co-patriots back at the office. I left him behind. I do know that from discussions at the board that certainly the water rights group has worked in tangent with the folks that are looking for storage and have done some urgency changes to try to do some of the pilot work associated with that, and it's a focus of future endeavors, and I think we have a lot to look forward to as we get into that and explore that area and what we can do there a lot more.